The year was 1911, and the late autumn air hung heavy with Louisiana's characteristic dampness as Thomas Williams steered his Model T down the narrow dirt road. The 40-year-old historian had traveled from Boston to the small parish of St. Elias to document local architectural history, particularly the old churches that dotted the bayou landscape. His Ford rattled and protested as it navigated the increasingly uneven terrain. Spanish moss draped from cypress trees like grey curtains on either side of the road. "You won't be wanting to go much further, sir," the local guide, Elijah, warned from the passenger seat. His weathered face remained expressionless, but his knuckles whitened as he gripped his knees. "Carter Land starts just beyond that bend. Ain't nobody been welcomed there in near 20 years. Thomas adjusted his wire-rimmed spectacles, squinting at the road ahead. The parish records indicate an unusual chapel on the property, pre-Civil War architecture with distinctive modifications. "I've received permission from the county clerk to photograph it." Elijah's expression darkened. "County clerk don't know what's good for him. Some places ought to stay forgotten." When the car rounded the bend, Thomas saw it for the first time. Standing on a small rise amid dying grass was the Carter family chapel, a stark white structure that seemed to shimmer in the late afternoon sun. Its design was unlike any other church in the region, Gothic in inspiration, but with strange angles that seemed slightly wrong, as if the builder had only seen drawings of churches but never visited one. "I'll wait with the automobile," Elijah said firmly. "Best be quick about your business, Mr. Williams. Dark comes early this time of year, and you don't want to be on Carter Land after sunset." Thomas gathered his camera equipment and notebook, excitement quickening his steps as he approached the chapel. The building was smaller than he'd expected, capable of seating perhaps 30 people at most. The white paint was remarkably well preserved, despite the chapel's apparent abandonment. Unusual carvings adorned the doorframe, not the expected Christian symbols, but intricate patterns that reminded Thomas of mathematical equations. As he placed his hand on the weathered door handle, a sharp pain shot through his palm. Drawing back, he noticed a small splinter of wood embedded in his skin. Thomas extracted it with his teeth and spat it onto the ground, watching with academic curiosity as a drop of his blood stained the white-painted wood. The door swung open with surprising ease, as if welcoming him inside. The chapel's interior was dim, illuminated only by the colored light filtering through narrow stained-glass windows. The windows depicted not saints or biblical scenes, but disturbing tableaus of kneeling children, their faces upturned toward a blinding light. Thomas counted 7 windows, each with a different child. At the front stood a simple altar of dark wood. Behind it hung not a cross, but a large circular emblem carved with the same mathematical patterns as the doorframe. Thomas raised his camera and began taking photographs, the flash powder briefly illuminating the chapel's interior. That's when he noticed the names carved into the floor. 7 names, each followed by dates. Carter boys, he realized. The youngest had been only 4 years old. As Thomas knelt to examine the carvings more closely, he felt something warm trickle from his nose. Touching his face, his fingers came away red with blood. The historian stood quickly, suddenly dizzy, his heart pounding in his chest. "Time to go," he whispered to himself, gathering his equipment with shaking hands. The silence inside the chapel had become oppressive, and Thomas could have sworn he heard soft whispers emanating from the walls themselves. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the sky in violent shades of red and purple. Elijah was pacing nervously beside the Model T. "You're bleeding, sir," the guide observed, his voice tight with fear. "Just a nosebleed," Thomas assured him, though he felt strangely weak. "Let's return to town. I believe I have enough photographs for today." As they drove away, Thomas glanced back at the chapel. For just a moment, he thought he saw 7 small figures standing in front of the building, watching his departure with hollow eyes. That night, in his rented room above the parish's only general store, Thomas developed his photographs with trembling hands. The images showed only an empty, abandoned chapel, No circular emblem, no carved names, no disturbing stained glass windows. Nothing except 7 small, blurry handprints on the altar reaching upward. Thomas couldn't sleep. The rain had started shortly after midnight, drumming against the tin roof of the general store and casting watery shadows across his small room. The photographs lay scattered across his bed, each showing the same impossible handprints that hadn't been visible to his naked eye. A knock at his door startled him. Thomas glanced at his pocket watch, 3:17 a.m. "Who's there?" he called, his voice betraying his nervousness. "Mr. Williams? It's Elijah, sir. We need to talk." Thomas opened the door to find his guide looking even more haggard than before, rain dripping from his coat onto the wooden floor. "You've been marked," Elijah said without preamble, stepping into the room and shutting the door behind him. His eyes fell on the photographs. "So you've seen them too?" "The handprints?" Thomas asked. "What does it mean?" Elijah sank into the room's only chair. "It means the Carter boys have chosen you to tell their story. It happens every few years. Someone comes to town, visits the chapel, and gets marked." He removed his hat, revealing thinning grey hair. "Last one was a traveling salesman in '04. Found him hanging from the chapel bell tower 3 weeks later." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. "That's preposterous. I'm a historian, a man of science." "Science won't help you here," Elijah said. "But I might. My grandmother worked for the Carters. She was there when it happened, when they started sacrificing their own sons." Despite his skepticism, Thomas found himself sitting on the edge of the bed, listening intently as Elijah spoke. "The Carters came to Louisiana in 1857, already wealthy from sugar plantations in the Caribbean. Jonathan Carter, the patriarch, brought his wife and 2 sons. They built that chapel first, before even their own house. People thought it strange, but the Carters paid well and asked few favors." Elijah's voice dropped to a near whisper. "But then the boys started dying. Every Sunday, one by one. 7 sons over 7 years. Each one found at the altar bloodless, with a look of terror frozen on their face. No marks, no wounds, just dead." Thomas glanced again at the photographs. If they were murdered, why wasn't Carter arrested? Because officially, those boys died of fever. The local doctor was in Carter's pocket, and the sheriff too. But my grandmother, she cleaned the chapel after each death, said she found strange markings under the altar rug, drawn in something that looked like blood but never dried. Thomas rubbed his temples, feeling the beginning of a headache. And what happened to the Carters after their sons died? Jonathan Carter lived to be 93, died rich as Croesus in 1906. His wife passed a year later. They had no more children after the 7 boys, left everything to some society up north. The property's been abandoned since, though sometimes folks see lights in the chapel at night. Elijah leaned forward. The way grandmother told it, Carter made some kind of deal. Sacrificed his sons for something. Wealth, maybe, or long life. And now those boys, their spirits are trapped in that chapel, looking for someone to free them. Thomas laughed nervously. "And you believe I've been chosen for this task?" "The blood on the door, the handprints, the mark." Elijah pointed to Thomas's palm, where the splinter had pierced his skin. Thomas was shocked to see an inflamed red pattern had formed around the small wound. The same mathematical symbols he'd seen carved into the chapel door. "What must I do?" Thomas asked, his scientific skepticism warring with the evidence before his eyes. "You need to learn the truth. All of it. Then you need to write it down, make it known. Only then will those boys rest." Elijah stood and moved toward the door. "Parish records are kept in the basement of the courthouse. Not the public ones, the real ones. Old Judge Thibodeau keeps the key. He's a drinking man, spends every evening at Carson's Tavern." After Elijah left, Thomas stared at his marked palm until dawn broke through the rain clouds. The historian in him demanded evidence, facts, documentation. If the Carter boys had indeed been sacrificed, there would be records, witnesses, proof. But another part of him, a part he'd never acknowledged before, recognized the mark for what it was, a doorway to something beyond his understanding. That morning, Thomas felt eyes on him everywhere he went in the small town. Locals who had been friendly the day before now crossed the street to avoid him. A young mother pulled her child close as he passed, whispering something that made the boy's eyes grow wide with fear. They know, Thomas realized. They all know about the Carter Chapel and what happened to those who became marked. The St. Elias Parish Courthouse stood like a grey monument to faded authority, its columns stained with decades of humidity and neglect. Thomas had spent the afternoon watching Judge Thibodeau, an elderly man with a shock of white hair and a perpetual scowl, preside over minor disputes before retiring to Carson's Tavern, as Elijah had predicted. Twilight cast long shadows across the town square as Thomas entered the dimly lit establishment. The smell of cheap whiskey and stale tobacco assaulted his senses. In the corner, Judge Thibodeau sat alone, nursing an amber-colored drink. Thomas ordered 2 whiskies and approached the judge's table. "Mind if I join you, Your Honor?" Thibodeau glanced up with bloodshot eyes. "You're the fellow from Boston, the one asking about the Carter Chapel." It wasn't a question. "News travels fast in a small town," Thomas observed, sliding one of the whiskies toward the judge, "especially when it concerns that place." Thibodeau accepted the drink with a nod. "Elijah sent you, I expect, looking for the old records." Thomas was taken aback by the judge's directness. "Yes, I need to understand what happened to the Carter boys." Thibodeau downed his whiskey in one swallow and reached for the second glass. "What makes you think I'd help you?" Thomas hesitated, then slowly turned his palm upward, revealing the inflamed symbol. The judge recoiled slightly, his face paling. "Christ almighty," he whispered. "It's happening again." "Please," Thomas urged. "I need to know the truth." The judge stared at him for a long moment before reaching into his waistcoat and producing a small brass key. "Basement door is behind the clerk's desk. Last room on the left holds the restricted archives. What you're looking for will be in the black ledgers marked 1857 to 1864. He pushed the key across the table. "I never gave you this, and for God's sake, be gone before morning." The courthouse was deserted when Thomas slipped inside through a side entrance. Using a small oil lamp to guide his way, he located the basement door and descended the narrow stairs into musty darkness. The restricted archives were exactly where the judge had described. A small room lined with shelves of leather-bound books and boxes of yellowed papers. Thomas located the black ledgers quickly. 7 volumes, one for each year a Carter boy had died. With trembling hands, he opened the first one, dated 1857. The official record showed that William Carter, age 7, had died of swamp fever on September 7, 1857. But attached to this entry was a sealed envelope. Thomas carefully opened it to find a different document, a true death certificate signed by Dr. James Moreau, the county physician. Cause of death: exsanguination through unknown means. Body discovered on altar of Carter Chapel. No visible wounds. Blood content estimated at less than 20% normal volume. Similar envelopes accompanied each boy's death record. Thomas read them all, his historian's mind cataloguing the horrific details. 1858, Jonathan Carter Jr., age 10, 1859. Samuel Carter, age 5, 1860. Benjamin Carter, age 8, 1861. Theodore Carter, age 6, 1862. Elias Carter, age 4, 1863. Zachariah Carter, age 9. Each boy had been found at the chapel altar, each bloodless without explanation, but it was the final record from 1864 that chilled Thomas to his core. The 7th son, Abraham Carter, age 12, had not been found bloodless. His death certificate read, "Subject appears to have died while attempting escape. Multiple lacerations consistent with window glass. Blood trail leads from altar to broken stained glass window. Body recovered 200 yards from chapel." Attached to Abraham's record was a folded piece of paper, a letter written in a child's unsteady hand. "Father performs the ritual again tomorrow. I've heard him and Mother talking. I am to be the last sacrifice. The others come to me at night. They have no faces anymore. They say Father made a deal with something that lives in the walls of the chapel, our blood for gold and long life. I tried to tell Sheriff Bishop, but he wouldn't listen. If anyone finds this, please know that my father is the devil himself. He built the chapel as a feeding place for the thing he worships. It needs blood to give its gifts. I will try to run tonight. If I live, I will burn that place to the ground. Abraham Carter, May 2nd, 1864. Thomas sat back, his mind reeling with the implications. Jonathan Carter had systematically sacrificed his own sons for wealth and longevity, and apparently received both, living to the remarkable age of 93, in an era when most men died decades younger. As he gathered the documents to make copies, Thomas heard a noise from the hallway, footsteps, slow and deliberate, too heavy to be the elderly judge returning for his key. Extinguishing his lamp, Thomas pressed himself against the wall beside the door, heart pounding as the footsteps drew closer. Through the darkness, he could make out a tall figure passing by the archives room, heading deeper into the basement. Thomas held his breath until the footsteps faded, then quickly gathered the most damning documents and slipped out of the room. As he crept up the basement stairs, he heard something that made his blood run cold, a child's voice singing softly, the sound emanating from the depths of the basement where the tall figure had disappeared. Outside, the night had grown unusually cold for Louisiana. Thomas hurried back to his lodgings, clutching the stolen documents to his chest. He had the evidence now, but something told him that merely documenting the Carter atrocities wouldn't be enough to free those 7 trapped souls. As he rounded the corner to the general store, Thomas stopped short. Standing in the middle of the street was a boy of about 12, wearing clothes from another era. The boy's face was unnaturally pale in the moonlight, his eyes dark hollows. "You have to finish it," the boy said, his voice somehow carrying clearly despite the distance between them. He's still there, still hungry. When Thomas blinked, the street was empty. Morning brought a heavy fog that clung to St. Elias like a burial shroud. Thomas had spent the night copying the documents and organizing his findings. His academic training told him to approach this methodically, to verify each piece of information before drawing conclusions. But the mark on his palm had spread overnight, the strange symbols now extending to his wrist, and Thomas felt time running short. He needed to learn more about the society that had inherited the Carter fortune. The documents mentioned an organization called the Eternal Fellowship, with a mailing address in New York City. Thomas decided his next step would be the local post office, which might have records of correspondence. The postmaster, a thin man named Clyde, with suspicious eyes, was initially reluctant to help. But when Thomas mentioned he was researching Louisiana architecture for the Smithsonian Institution, a small lie that felt justified under the circumstances, Clyde's demeanor changed. "We keep records going back to 1890, he said, leading Thomas to a back room filled with dusty ledgers. "What name are you looking for?" "The Eternal Fellowship," Thomas replied. "They would have received mail at the Carter property until around 1906 or 1907. Clyde's face twitched slightly. "You'd best look yourself," he said, pointing to a shelf of leather-bound books. "I've got customers waiting." Alone in the archives, Thomas quickly located the relevant ledgers. The Eternal Fellowship had indeed received regular correspondence, not just after the Carters' deaths, but dating back to at least 1890. More interestingly, they had sent quarterly packages to Jonathan Carter while he was alive, packages that required special handling due to their weight. Thomas copied down the New York address and was about to leave when he noticed a more recent entry. In January of 1911, just 9 months earlier, a large crate had been delivered to the abandoned Carter Chapel, sent by the Eternal Fellowship. Someone was still using the chapel. As Thomas exited the post office, he nearly collided with Sheriff Duplantis, a burly man with a thick moustache and cold eyes. "Mr. Williams," the sheriff said, blocking Thomas's path. "Judge Thibodeau tells me you've been asking questions about the old Carter place." Thomas attempted to appear casual. "Just historical research, Sheriff. I'm documenting Louisiana's religious architecture. Is that why you broke into the courthouse last night?" The sheriff's hand rested on his holstered pistol. "Judge Thibodeau reported several documents missing this morning." Thomas felt his mouth go dry. "There must be some mistake." "I think not," Duplantis interrupted. "I'm placing you under arrest for breaking and entering, theft of county property, and trespassing on private land." As the sheriff reached for his handcuffs, a commotion erupted across the street. A horse had broken free from its hitching post and was galloping wildly down the main thoroughfare, forcing Duplantis to jump aside. In the confusion, Thomas bolted, running through narrow alleys until he reached the boarding house. He knew he had minutes at most before the sheriff returned. Gathering his camera, notes, and the copied documents, Thomas fled to the back of the general store where he had parked his Model T. To his immense relief, the automobile started on the first attempt. Thomas had no clear destination in mind as he drove away from St. Elias, but found himself inexorably drawn back toward the road leading to the Carter Chapel. He needed to see it again in daylight, to document the evidence with fresh eyes now that he understood what had happened there. The chapel stood as it had before, white and somehow pristine despite decades of abandonment. This time, Thomas noticed something he had overlooked. A small building behind the chapel, half hidden by overgrown vegetation. A caretaker's cottage, perhaps. Approaching cautiously, Thomas saw that, unlike the chapel, the cottage showed signs of recent habitation. Fresh boot prints marked the dirt path to its door, and smoke stains darkened the chimney. The door was unlocked. Inside, Thomas found a Spartan living space, a bed, a table, a chair, and a pot-bellied stove. On the table lay an open ledger, its pages filled with neat columns of dates and names. With growing horror, Thomas realized he was looking at a record of children who had gone missing from surrounding parishes over the past 5 decades. Next to the ledger sat a brass key identical to the one Judge Thibodeau had given him, and a letter dated August 15th, 1911. Thomas read it with trembling hands. "Brother Bishop, the centennial approaches. Preparations must be completed by year's end. The fellowship will arrive December 20th to witness the renewal. 7 vessels are required as always. Your selections from Vermilion Parish are approved. Acquisition must be completed by November 30th to allow for purification. The Carter line has thinned, but the blood obligation remains. Young Daniel Carter has been located in Charleston and will arrive by train on December 1st. His sacrifice will anchor the others." In eternal service, Grand Overseer Thorne Thomas staggered backward, his mind reeling. The sacrifices hadn't ended with the Carter boys. They had continued in secret for decades, and now the fellowship was planning something larger, something that required new sacrifices, including a descendant of the original Carter family. A board creaked behind him. Thomas whirled around to find Sheriff Duplantis standing in the doorway, revolver aimed at Thomas's chest. "You should have left when you had the chance, Mr. Williams," the sheriff said coldly. "You're part of it," Thomas realized aloud. "Bishop was sheriff in the 1860s. You're his successor, in more ways than one." Duplantis smiled thinly. "The fellowship rewards loyalty across generations. My grandfather served Jonathan Carter, my father served the fellowship, and I do the same. By helping them kidnap and murder children." Thomas felt sick. "By helping maintain the order of things," Duplantis corrected. "The gifts flow to those who serve. The town prospers. A few orphans and runaways are a small price to pay." "And Daniel Carter?" Thomas asked. "Is he an orphan too?" Something flickered across the sheriff's face. Doubt, perhaps, or guilt. "The Carter blood is special. It binds the covenant." Thomas glanced down at his marked palm, the symbols now clearly matching those in the chapel carvings. "What happens to those who are marked?" "They serve a different purpose," Duplantis said quietly. "The entity requires witnesses as well as sacrifices. You'll understand soon enough." A sudden chill filled the cottage, and Thomas heard the now familiar sound of children's whispers. The sheriff heard it too, his eyes widening as he glanced around nervously. "They're getting stronger," he muttered. "It's not supposed to happen yet." Taking advantage of the sheriff's distraction, Thomas lunged forward, knocking the revolver aside as it discharged. The bullet splintered the wall as both men crashed to the floor. Thomas, younger and fueled by desperate fear, managed to gain the upper hand, striking Duplantis with enough force to render him unconscious. Breathing heavily, Thomas bound the sheriff with a rope found under the bed, then gathered the ledger and letter as evidence. He had to warn someone, had to stop what was coming in December. As he stepped outside, Thomas was confronted by 7 translucent figures, the Carter boys, their features now clearly visible in the daylight. Unlike the frightening, hollow-eyed apparitions of his nightmares, they appeared now as ordinary children, their expressions solemn but determined. The oldest boy, whom Thomas somehow knew was Abraham, stepped forward. "You've seen the truth," he said, his voice sounding distant yet clear. "But seeing isn't enough. The chapel must be destroyed, and the entity within it bound again. Only Carter blood can break the covenant." "I'm not a Carter," Thomas protested. "But you're marked," Abraham replied, pointing to Thomas's palm. "That makes you a conduit. With the right ritual, you can channel our presence into something powerful enough to end this." Thomas looked at the 7 boys, victims of unimaginable betrayal. "Tell me what to do." The sun was beginning its descent when Thomas finished gathering the materials Abraham had instructed him to find: salt from the general store, graveyard dirt from the cemetery behind the Methodist church, 7 white candles, and most disturbingly, a vial of his own blood, drawn carefully from a cut on his arm. The sheriff remained bound and unconscious in the caretaker's cottage. Thomas had discovered a hidden cellar beneath the cottage floor, containing wooden cages sized for children. The sight had hardened his resolve. Whatever the cost, the cycle of sacrifices had to end. As twilight approached, Thomas entered the chapel for the second time. The interior looked different now. The stained glass windows clearly depicted the 7 Carter boys, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. The altar at the front gleamed with dark stains that Thomas now recognized as decades of dried blood. Following Abraham's instructions, Thomas poured a circle of salt around the altar, then placed the 7 candles at specific points corresponding to the windows. As he lit each candle, he spoke the name of the corresponding Carter son. William Carter, firstborn. Jonathan Carter Jr., the dutiful. Samuel Carter, the gentle. Benjamin Carter, the scholar. Theodore Carter, the artist. Elias Carter, the innocent. Abraham Carter, the brave. With each name, the temperature in the chapel dropped further, until Thomas could see his breath clouding before him. The flames of the candles burned blue-white, casting eerie shadows across the walls. The final step was the most difficult. Thomas had to lie upon the altar and allow his blood, now connected to the chapel through the mark, to spill onto the ancient wood. Steeling himself, Thomas reclined on the cold stone surface and reopened the wound on his arm, letting the blood drip onto the altar. The effect was immediate and terrifying. The chapel began to vibrate, dust and fragments of plaster raining down from the ceiling. The stained glass windows shimmered as the images of the boys seemed to step out of the glass, becoming 3-dimensional figures that floated toward the altar. Thomas wanted to flee, but found himself unable to move, his body seemingly fused to the altar. A deep, inhuman voice reverberated through the chapel. "Who dares interrupt the covenant?" The spectral form of Abraham Carter stood at Thomas's head, facing the source of the voice, a darkening mass gathering at the chapel's entrance. "We dare," Abraham answered, his childish voice somehow carrying the weight of all 7 brothers. "You took our lives against our will. The covenant was false." "The covenant was sealed with willing blood," the voice countered. "Your father offered freely." "But we did not," Abraham responded. And Carter blood flows in our veins as it did in his. We have the right to challenge the covenant. The dark mass pulsed angrily, tendrils of shadow stretching toward the altar. You have no power here. Your blood is spent. Your souls are mine. Thomas felt a crushing weight on his chest as the entity focused its attention on him. And this one is merely marked, not of the blood. He cannot help you. Abraham looked down at Thomas, his translucent eyes filled with sorrow. He can be the vessel, our strength through his sacrifice. With a jolt of horror, Thomas realized what Abraham meant. The boys couldn't break the covenant themselves. They needed a living sacrifice to channel their combined power. They had lured him here, just as the entity had lured their father. "No!" Thomas gasped, struggling against the invisible force pinning him to the altar. "I won't be part of another sacrifice." Abraham leaned closer, his ghostly form flickering. "Not a sacrifice," he whispered. "A conduit. We don't need your life, just your will. Let us in, Mr. Williams. Let us use your strength to break the chains." Thomas hesitated, then nodded slightly. "Do it." The 7 spectral boys moved as one, their forms merging into Thomas's body. The pain was excruciating, like ice and fire flowing through his veins simultaneously. Thomas screamed as his back arched off the altar, his eyes glowing with the same blue-white light as the candles. When he spoke again, it was with the combined voices of all 7 Carter boys. "The covenant is broken," they said through Thomas's mouth. "Your claim on this place is ended." The dark entity shrieked, a sound so terrible that the remaining windows in the chapel shattered. "You cannot. The fellowship will complete the centennial. 7 more will feed me." "Not through our bloodline," the boys replied. "The circle is broken." Thomas the boys sat up on the altar, raising both hands. The mark had spread to cover Thomas's entire body, the strange symbols glowing with blue fire. "We reclaim our blood," they intoned. "We reclaim our souls." The entity lunged forward, a mass of darkness and hunger, but it could not cross the salt circle. The candles flared higher as the Carter boys, channeling through Thomas, began to recite words in a language Thomas didn't recognize but somehow understood. An unbinding, a severing of ties between the entity and the physical world. The chapel began to collapse around them as the entity thrashed and fought against the ritual. Beams crashed down, walls buckled, but the altar remained intact, protected by the salt circle and the power of the 7 united souls. As the ritual reached its crescendo, Thomas felt the boys preparing to leave his body. In that moment of connection, he understood everything. How Jonathan Carter had discovered the entity while digging the chapel foundation. How it had promised him wealth and long life in exchange for his son's blood. How the fellowship had continued the sacrifices to maintain their own prosperity. With a final surge of power, the boys completed the unbinding. The entity gave one last inhuman shriek before collapsing in on itself, leaving nothing but a scorched mark on the chapel floor. The ghosts of the 7 boys stood before Thomas once more, now appearing solid and whole, the horror wiped from their faces. "It's done," Abraham said, smiling for the first time. "The covenant is broken." "What about the fellowship?" Thomas asked. His own voice returned to him. "They're still coming in December. They'll find nothing but ruins," William the eldest replied. "Their power came from the entity. Without it, they're just men." "And the sheriff?" "Leave him for the authorities," Abraham suggested. "The evidence you've gathered will be enough." Thomas looked around at the collapsing chapel. "I should go before I'm buried here." "Yes," Abraham agreed. "Our time is done as well. We can rest now." As Thomas staggered out of the crumbling building, he looked back to see the 7 boys holding hands, their forms growing transparent again, but now suffused with a peaceful light rather than the cold blue of their haunting. They waved once, then faded from sight as the chapel roof finally gave way, burying the altar and the scorched mark of the entity beneath tons of debris. Thomas drove straight to the nearest telegraph office in the next parish, sending urgent messages to the governor of Louisiana and to his colleagues at the Smithsonian, detailing the kidnapping plot and including the location of the imprisoned Sheriff Duplantis and the evidence in the caretaker's cottage. The mark on his palm had faded to a faint scar, but Thomas knew he would never forget the Carter boys or the burden they had carried for nearly 50 years. He had come to Louisiana seeking architectural history and had instead uncovered a darker chapter, one of sacrifice, covenant, and ultimately redemption. December arrived with an unusual cold snap that left the bayous crusted with thin ice. Thomas had spent the intervening weeks in New Orleans, working with state authorities to build a case against the Eternal Fellowship. Sheriff Duplantis had been arrested, but had hanged himself in his cell before revealing the names of his conspirators. The ledger from the caretaker's cottage, however, had provided a wealth of information, including addresses and meeting dates. On December 18th, 2 days before the planned renewal, Thomas sat in a hotel room with Agent Curtis Donovan of the newly formed Bureau of Investigation. Maps and photographs covered every surface, detailing the movements of fellowship members arriving in Louisiana from across the country. "Our agents have identified 12 high-ranking members so far," Donovan explained, his Boston accent reminding Thomas of home. "Bankers, judges, even a congressman. All wealthy, all with connections to the original Carter fortune." "And Daniel Carter?" Thomas asked. The young descendant had been his primary concern. "Safe," Donovan confirmed. "We intercepted him at the Charleston station. He had no idea why he'd been summoned to Louisiana, just told it concerned an inheritance." Thomas nodded, relieved. "What about the New York address, the fellowship headquarters?" "Abandoned," Donovan said grimly. "They cleared out the day after our first arrests, but we found this." He handed Thomas a leather-bound book with a familiar symbol embossed on its cover, the same mathematical pattern from the chapel. Thomas opened it carefully. Inside was a detailed history of the entity, which the fellowship called the Provider. According to their records, it had existed since ancient times, moving between various cultures and taking different forms, always requiring blood sacrifice in exchange for its gifts. Jonathan Carter had not discovered it by accident. His family had been servants of the Provider for generations, going back to 17th century England. The Louisiana chapel was merely its latest feeding ground. Most disturbing were the accounts of the Centennial Renewal, a ritual performed every 100 years that required the sacrifice of 7 children, including one from the servant bloodline. The last renewal had been in 1811, in a different location with a different family, but with the same entity at its core. December 20th, 1911 would mark exactly 100 years, Thomas realized aloud. Donovan nodded. And without this renewal, according to their beliefs, all the wealth and power granted by this Provider would crumble. He closed the book with evident disgust. Superstitious nonsense, of course, but it drove them to murder children. Thomas wasn't so certain it was merely superstition. He had felt the entity's power, had seen what it could do, but he kept these thoughts to himself. His reputation had suffered enough from his fanciful initial reports. "The operation begins at sundown tomorrow," Donovan continued. "The remaining fellowship members will gather at the designated backup location, an abandoned sugar mill near Vermilion Parish. We'll be waiting." Thomas insisted on accompanying the agents, despite Donovan's objections. He needed to see this through to its end, needed to ensure that the Carter boys' freedom had not come at the cost of 7 new victims. The next evening, Thomas found himself crouched behind rusting machinery in the old mill, watching as black automobiles arrived one by one. Hooded figures emerged, carrying ceremonial implements, and, most chillingly, a large wooden cage covered with a black cloth. Donovan gave the signal when the last car arrived. Federal agents swarmed the mill from all sides, armed with pistols and shotguns. The fellowship members scattered in panic, some surrendering immediately, others attempting to flee into the surrounding swamps. In the chaos, Thomas lost sight of the cage. Breaking away from the agents, he searched frantically through the mill until he found it abandoned near an altar-like stone table. With trembling hands, he pulled away the black cloth. The cage was empty. "They weren't able to collect the children," came Donovan's voice from behind him. The agent holstered his pistol, his expression grim but satisfied. "We intercepted their operatives in 3 parishes last week. The families have been warned and protected." Thomas sagged with relief, running a hand across his face. "And the fellowship members?" "8 in custody so far. 3 tried to escape through the swamp." Donovan's face hardened. "The bayou has its own justice. They won't be found." As federal agents led the hooded figures to waiting vehicles, Thomas approached the stone table. It was ancient, predating the sugar mill by centuries, with familiar mathematical symbols carved around its edges. The Fellowship hadn't chosen this location by accident. Somehow, they had known of another connection to their entity. One of the captured men, taller than the others and carrying himself with aristocratic bearing despite his handcuffs, locked eyes with Thomas as he passed. "You," the man said, his voice cultured and precise. "You're the one who destroyed the chapel, the marked witness." Thomas stepped closer, studying the man's face. "And you are?" "Grand Overseer Thorne," the man replied without a trace of shame. "You've interfered with matters beyond your understanding, Mr. Williams. The provider has existed for millennia before the Carters and will find new servants long after we're gone." "Not if I can help it," Thomas said firmly. Thorne laughed, a cold sound devoid of humor. "The mark on your palm connects you to it now. You'll feel its call. Others have tried to destroy it. The Babylonians, the Romans, even the early church. All eventually became its servants instead." As Thorne was led away, Thomas unconsciously rubbed his palm where the mark had been. Though faded, it occasionally itched and burned, especially at night when his dreams were filled with whispers promising wealth and power if he would only rebuild the altar, restart the covenant. Thomas shook off the disturbing thoughts. He needed to ensure that all traces of the entity's influence were eliminated. Spring 1912 found Thomas back in Boston, surrounded by the comfortable familiarity of his office at Harvard. His Louisiana experience had left him changed, more cautious, more aware of the shadows at the edge of rational understanding. His colleagues had welcomed him back with a mixture of concern and skepticism. The official story, that he had helped uncover a kidnapping ring with occult trappings, was accepted, if somewhat reluctantly. The evidence against the Eternal Fellowship had been substantial enough to secure convictions for conspiracy and attempted kidnapping, though the more supernatural elements had been carefully excluded from court proceedings. Most of the Fellowship members were now serving lengthy prison sentences. Thorne himself had been sentenced to life imprisonment. Thomas had thrown himself into researching the entity, tracking its appearances throughout history under different names and guises. The pattern was always the same, a powerful being offering prosperity and longevity in exchange for blood sacrifice, particularly the blood of children from the servant's own family line. He traced references in ancient Sumerian tablets, in obscure medieval texts, in the records of witch trials across Europe. Always 7 sacrifices, always followed by prosperity for the sacrifices, always requiring renewal at 100-year intervals. The Carters had merely been the latest in a long line of families who had entered into this covenant, and if Thorne was to be believed, they would not be the last. Thomas's research had culminated in a detailed manuscript documenting the entity's history and methods. He had hesitated to publish it, aware that it might seem like the ravings of a madman to the academic community, or worse, serve as a how-to guide for those seeking to contact the entity themselves. Instead, he had sent copies to trusted colleagues around the world, anthropologists, theologians, and historians who might recognize similar patterns in their own research. A network of watchers, prepared to intervene if the entity appeared again. On a rainy April evening, Thomas was preparing to leave his office when his telephone rang. "Professor Williams speaking," he answered, cradling the receiver between shoulder and ear as he gathered his papers. "Thomas, it's Daniel Carter." The young man's voice was tense, with barely controlled fear. Thomas froze. Daniel Carter had returned to Charleston after his narrow escape, supposedly safe from the Fellowship's plans. "Daniel, what's wrong?" "The dreams have started," Daniel said quietly. "Just like you warned they might. I see the chapel, though I've never been there. I hear whispers, promises." Thomas sank into his chair. "You're of the bloodline. The entity is trying to reach you." "I thought it was destroyed when the chapel collapsed." "Weakened," Thomas corrected. "Bound, perhaps, but Thorne believed it could never truly be destroyed." He paused, considering his next words carefully. "Have you told anyone else about these dreams?" "No," Daniel replied, "but someone's been watching my house. I've seen the same automobile parked across the street for 3 days now." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. "Pack a bag, only essentials. I'll wire you train fare to Boston immediately." "You think the Fellowship is still active?" "Thorne had many followers we never identified," Thomas explained. "And if the entity is reaching out to you, they may sense it too." After arranging for Daniel's journey, Thomas returned to his manuscript, adding a new chapter about the entity's apparent ability to survive the destruction of its physical anchor. If it could reach out to Daniel Carter across such distance, it was far from defeated. Thomas was so absorbed in his writing that he almost missed the soft footsteps in the corridor outside his office. At this hour, the building should have been nearly empty. He quietly opened his desk drawer and removed the revolver he had taken to carrying since Louisiana. The footsteps stopped outside his door. Thomas held his breath, finger resting lightly on the trigger. After a long moment, an envelope slid under the door. The footsteps retreated down the hallway. Thomas waited until he could no longer hear them before approaching the envelope. It bore no name or address, only a wax seal impressed with a familiar mathematical symbol. Inside was a single sheet of expensive stationery, covered in elegant handwriting. "Professor Williams, you believe your victory at the chapel to be complete. It is not. The provider is patient." The Carter line continues. "The covenant will be renewed. The 7 boys you helped liberate remain bound to this world. Ask yourself why you still dream of them, why the mark on your palm still burns. You did not break the chain, you merely inserted yourself into it." December 20th, 2011. 100 years. The cycle continues. Our ranks are deeper than you know, our resources beyond your comprehension. You have made powerful enemies, Professor, but it is not too late for you to become a powerful friend instead. The offer remains open until the summer solstice. After that, we cannot guarantee your safety or that of young Mr. Carter. With eternal regards, the Fellowship. Thomas stared at the letter, his hands shaking. He had hoped the nightmares would fade with time, that the occasional burning of his scar was merely psychological, but the Fellowship's words confirmed his worst fears. His connection to the entity remained. More troubling was their knowledge of Daniel Carter's whereabouts and Thomas's continued involvement. The Fellowship had infiltrators everywhere, it seemed. That night, Thomas gathered his most important research and the original documents from Louisiana into a fireproof lockbox. The Fellowship might threaten him, might even succeed in silencing him eventually, but his knowledge would survive. The battle against the entity and its servants would continue long past his lifetime. Thomas had to ensure that future generations would have the weapons they needed: knowledge, vigilance, and the understanding that some covenants once made were almost impossible to break. Daniel Carter arrived in Boston 3 days later, thin and nervous, his eyes shadowed from lack of sleep. At 23, he was the last known descendant of Jonathan Carter, though he had never known his infamous ancestor. His family had changed their name after the Louisiana incidents, hoping to escape the tainted legacy. "The dreams are getting worse," Daniel confessed as they sat in Thomas's study, rain lashing against the windows. "I see the chapel, the altar. I see children. Boys who look like they might be relatives. They watch me with hollow eyes." Thomas nodded grimly. "The 7 Carter sons. Your ancestors, in a way. They were sacrificed by their father to this entity. Why would it want me? I've done nothing wrong." "It's not about right or wrong," Thomas explained. "It's about blood. You carry the Carter bloodline, which means you can serve as a connection to this world for the entity." Daniel shuddered, wrapping his hands around a cup of tea that had long gone cold. "And these people, this fellowship, they want to use me as part of some ritual?" "The centennial renewal requires blood from the original Covenant family," Thomas confirmed. "Without it, the entity cannot maintain its connection to our world. So I am to be sacrificed, like those boys?" Thomas hesitated. "Not exactly. The original covenant required 7 sons of the primary bloodline, but after a century, the requirements change. According to my research, the renewal needs only 1 direct descendant, plus 6 others without blood connection." Daniel looked up sharply. "What happens if they don't get what they need? If I remain hidden?" "The entity weakens. Its gifts, the wealth and power it provides to its servants, begin to fade." Thomas leaned forward, his expression intense. "That's why the Fellowship is so desperate to find you. Without the renewal, they lose everything." "Then I'll disappear," Daniel said with sudden determination. "Change my name again, go somewhere they'll never find me. Canada, perhaps, or Europe." Thomas shook his head slowly. "They would find you. The entity has ways of tracking its bloodline." He touched his palm unconsciously. "And there's something else to consider. If the entity can't complete its renewal through you, it might seek another Carter descendant." "There are no others," Daniel insisted. "My parents were only children. My grandparents as well, from what I know." "Bloodlines are complicated things," Thomas said carefully. "Records can be hidden or falsified. There might be branches of your family tree you're unaware of." A look of horror crossed Daniel's face. "You think they would sacrifice a distant cousin if they couldn't get to me, someone who doesn't even know their connection to the Carters?" "I think the entity would accept any blood relation, no matter how distant." Thomas's voice was heavy with the weight of his research. "It's happened before, in other cycles." Daniel stood suddenly, pacing the study. "Then hiding isn't enough. We need to stop this permanently. Destroy the entity completely." Thomas admired the young man's courage, so different from his ancestors' willing participation in evil. "I've been researching methods. The chapel was its anchor point, and destroying that weakened it considerably. But to sever its connection to this world entirely—" He retrieved a thick folder from his desk. "There are accounts of similar entities throughout history. Some were supposedly banished through specific rituals, others through the sacrifice of their primary servant." "Oh, more blood," Daniel said bitterly. "Always more blood." "Not necessarily," Thomas countered. "The most promising account comes from 16th century Prague. A rabbi there created a specific sequence of symbols, a mathematical formula essentially, that could bind such entities, not destroy them but trap them so completely they could never influence our world again." "And you have this formula?" Thomas smiled grimly. "Portions of it. I've been working to reconstruct the rest, based on the symbols from the chapel and other historical sources." Daniel looked at the complex diagrams spread across Thomas's desk. "Even if we complete it, how would we use it? The chapel is gone." "The entity requires a physical anchor," Thomas explained. "The chapel was built specifically for that purpose. But the fellowship letter mentioned preparations for 2011. They're planning to construct a new anchor." "The stone table at the sugar mill," Daniel realized. "Could that serve as an anchor?" "Possibly, though it's under federal custody now." Thomas considered the problem. "The entity needs a connection to the bloodline and a physical anchor in our world. If we could sever both—" A knock at the study door interrupted them. Thomas's housekeeper entered, looking apologetic. "I'm sorry to disturb you, Professor, but there's a gentleman insisting on seeing you. A Mr. Elijah Jones." Thomas straightened in surprise. Elijah, from Louisiana. The elderly guide who had first warned Thomas about the Carter Chapel entered the study, removing his rain-soaked hat. His weathered face showed new lines of worry. "Forgive the intrusion, Mr. Williams," he said, his Louisiana drawl pronounced in the formal Boston setting, "but matters have taken a turn that couldn't wait for telegram or telephone." "What's happened?" Thomas asked, gesturing for Elijah to take a seat. "They're rebuilding it," Elijah said without preamble. "The chapel, different location just outside Baton Rouge, but the same design, same symbols." Thomas felt the blood drain from his face. "How do you know this?" "My cousin works construction. They hired local men, thinking they wouldn't recognize the significance." Elijah shook his head. "But our families remember. We've passed down the stories." "How far along is the construction?" Thomas demanded. "Foundation laid. Walls going up. They're working day and night." Elijah's gaze shifted to Daniel. "This must be the Carter boy." Daniel nodded stiffly. "Daniel Carter." "They know you're here," Elijah told him bluntly. "They've got people watching the professor's house right now. 2 men in a black Packard across the street." Thomas moved to the window, carefully pulling back the curtain. Sure enough, a black automobile was parked under a street lamp, 2 shadowy figures visible inside. "We need to leave immediately," he decided. "Take only what you can carry. We'll use the back door and my neighbor's garden to reach the next street." As Daniel hurried to gather his things, Elijah pulled Thomas aside. "There's more," the old man said quietly. "The sheriff's records were more extensive than we thought. They've identified other Carter descendants. Distant cousins, mostly, but with enough of the bloodline for their purposes." Thomas felt sick. "How many?" "3 confirmed. 2 in New Orleans, 1 in Mississippi, all children between 7 and 12. "Dear God," Thomas whispered, "even if we protect Daniel, they still have alternatives," Elijah finished grimly. The cycle continues. The train journey south was tense, each of them constantly watching for fellowship agents. Thomas had telegraphed ahead to Agent Donovan, but the federal investigator was in Washington and wouldn't reach Louisiana for at least 3 days. By then, the new chapel might be complete enough to serve the entity's purposes. Thomas used the journey to continue working on the binding formula. With Daniel and Elijah's help, he spread his research across their private compartment, connecting fragments of symbols from different historical sources. The Prague rabbi believed these entities exist at the intersection of mathematics and spirit, Thomas explained. They're bound by certain numerical laws that, once understood, can be used against them. Daniel, who had studied engineering at university, quickly grasped the patterns. "It's a sequence," he realized, arranging several papers in a specific order. "Each symbol builds on the previous one, creating a kind of mathematical trap." "Exactly," Thomas nodded, impressed. "The entity is drawn to patterns of 7 sacrifices, 7-year cycles within the 100-year renewal. If we can create a countering pattern of 8, it disrupts the entity's ability to maintain coherence in our world." Elijah, who had been silently observing, finally spoke. "My grandmother used to talk about closing the circle, said the Carters left it open deliberately to allow the thing to come through." Thomas looked up sharply. "Did she say how?" "Something about the altar, how it was carved with symbols on only 3 sides, leaving the 4th open like a door." This new information sent Thomas back to his notes on the chapel's construction. He had photographs of the altar before its destruction, and sure enough, the 4th side had been left blank, while the other 3 were covered in the mathematical symbols. "That's it," he breathed. "The formula needs to complete the circle, to close the door they left open." By the time they reached New Orleans, Thomas and Daniel had reconstructed most of the binding formula. The final elements would need to be adapted specifically to the new chapel, once they could observe its construction. Elijah led them to a safe house in the French Quarter, owned by a family that had opposed the Carters for generations. Thomas was surprised to find several other people already gathered there, representatives from old Louisiana families who had long suspected the truth about the fellowship and its activities. "We've been watching them for decades," explained Marie Laveau, an elderly woman whose grandmother had reportedly been a famed voodoo priestess of the same name. "They take our children, our neighbors' children, always the vulnerable ones, the ones they think won't be missed. But they are missed," added Robert Thibodeau, grandson of the judge who had helped Thomas a year earlier. "And we remember." This informal resistance group had been tracking fellowship activities throughout the region. They had identified the location of the new chapel, a remote property outside Baton Rouge owned by a corporation that traced back to one of the imprisoned fellowship members. "They've been preparing for this renewal for decades," Robert explained, unrolling architectural plans on the dining table. "These were drawn up in 1890, with modifications made every few years." Thomas studied the plans with growing concern. The new chapel was larger than the original, with space beneath the altar that hadn't existed in the Carter building. "What's this chamber for?" he asked, pointing to the underground room. Marie's face darkened. "Storage, we believe, for the children they plan to take." Daniel, who had been quiet since their arrival, suddenly spoke. "We need to destroy it before it's completed. Burn it to the ground." "They have armed guards," Robert cautioned. "At least 6 men patrolling the property at all times. And burning it won't be enough," Thomas added. "They would simply rebuild elsewhere. We need to bind the entity permanently, prevent it from ever forming another covenant." Thomas shared his reconstructed formula with the group, explaining how it could be used to close the doorway between worlds. Several members were skeptical, but Marie nodded in understanding. "My grandmother would have called this different names, but the principle is the same," she said. "Binding rather than banishing, closing rather than destroying." "We'll need access to the altar before they consecrate it," Thomas explained. "Once the entity has established its connection, our task becomes much more difficult." "The construction will be completed in 3 days," Robert reported. "The consecration is scheduled for the night of the full moon, this Thursday." Thomas calculated quickly. "That gives us less than 72 hours to finalize the formula and infiltrate the site." "I should be the one to go," Daniel volunteered. "The entity is connected to my bloodline. If anyone can disrupt its plans, it's me." Thomas wanted to object, to protect the young man from further involvement, but he'd recognized the truth in Daniel's words. The Carter blood was both the entity's strength and potentially its weakness. "Not alone," Thomas insisted. "I'll go with you." Marie cleared her throat. "My nephew works for the construction company. He can get 2 people onto the site tomorrow morning as new laborers. But only 2. It was decided. Thomas and Daniel would infiltrate the construction site, using the opportunity to inscribe the binding formula onto the unfinished altar. Robert and Elijah would create a distraction if needed, while Marie prepared traditional protections for everyone involved. That night, as the others slept, Thomas finalized the formula. The mathematical sequence was elegant in its complexity, each symbol flowing naturally into the next to create a perfect circle of 8 interconnected patterns. As he drew the final symbol, Thomas felt a sharp pain in his palm. The scar had reopened, blood welling from the mark that connected him to the entity. He quickly pressed a handkerchief to the wound, but not before a drop of blood fell onto the paper, directly in the center of the completed formula. The drop spread in a perfect circle, then dried almost instantly into a dark red stain. Thomas stared at it, remembering Thorne's warning about becoming part of the chain rather than breaking it. Had he inadvertently created a new connection, or had he just sealed the binding with his own blood? Either way, there was no turning back now. In less than 12 hours, he and Daniel would attempt to close a door that had remained open for over a century, a door through which an ancient hunger had fed on generation after generation of innocent blood. Dawn broke grey and misty over the Louisiana countryside as Thomas and Daniel, dressed as labourers, approached the construction site of the new chapel. Marie's nephew, Antoine, had vouched for them as experienced carpenters from Shreveport, securing them positions working on the altar itself. The chapel rose from the misty ground like a pale spectre, its white walls nearly complete. Thomas was struck by how precisely it mirrored the original Carter Chapel, down to the unusual angles and proportions that had disturbed him on first sight over a year ago. The foreman, a burly man with suspicious eyes, assigned them to the interior detail without much questioning. As they entered the chapel, Thomas felt a familiar chill. The entity's presence, though weaker than in the completed Carter Chapel, was already detectable. The altar stood at the front, still under construction. As Elijah had described, 3 sides were already carved with intricate mathematical patterns, while the 4th remained blank, the doorway through which the entity would fully enter once the chapel was consecrated. Thomas and Daniel worked methodically through the morning, gaining the trust of the other laborers while studying the altar's construction. During a midday break, when the other workers stepped outside to eat, Thomas quickly measured the blank 4th panel. "It's exactly as we calculated," he whispered to Daniel. "The binding formula will fit perfectly." Daniel nodded, keeping watch at the door. "When do we do it?" "Tonight," Thomas decided. "The night shift has only 2 guards. We'll return after midnight." They completed their day's work without raising suspicion, then retreated to a small motel in Baton Rouge, where Elijah waited with their equipment, chisels, the completed formula, and vials of a mixture Marie had prepared to seal the carvings once completed. "This powder contains graveyard dirt, salt, and herbs from Marie's garden," Elijah explained. "She says it will strengthen the binding if rubbed into the fresh carvings." Thomas nodded, remembering how the salt circle had temporarily contained the entity during the confrontation at the Carter Chapel. Marie's traditional knowledge complemented his academic research in ways he was still learning to appreciate. At midnight, they approached the chapel site from the surrounding woods, avoiding the main road where guards might be watching. The nearly full moon provided enough light to navigate, though they kept their lanterns shuttered until absolutely necessary. The chapel stood silent in the moonlight, its white walls ghostly. A single guard patrolled the perimeter, while another presumably watched the main entrance. "There," Elijah whispered, pointing to a small window near the back. "Service entrance to the vestry. Should be large enough for you too." Thomas and Daniel crept forward, while Elijah remained hidden in the trees, ready to create a distraction if needed. The window was unlocked, an oversight in security that Thomas found almost too convenient, but they had no choice but to proceed. Inside, the chapel was dark except for moonlight streaming through the unfinished stained-glass windows. These windows, Thomas noted with a shudder, were being designed with the same disturbing images of kneeling children as the original chapel. The altar stood in shadow at the front. Thomas carefully unshuttered his lantern, keeping the light low as they approached. Daniel carried the tools wrapped in cloth to muffle any sound. As they reached the altar, the temperature in the chapel plummeted. Their breath fogged in the suddenly frigid air. "It knows we're here," Daniel whispered, his face pale in the lantern light. "Then we work quickly," Thomas replied, unfolding the paper containing the binding formula. "You carve, I'll read the symbols. We need absolute precision." Daniel began carefully chiseling the first symbol into the blank 4th panel of the altar. The sound seemed unnaturally loud in the silent chapel, but there was no sign of the guards being alerted. As the first symbol took shape, a low vibration began in the floor beneath them. Thomas continued reading the formula, guiding Daniel through each intricate pattern. The vibration intensified with each completed symbol, and a faint whispering seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. "It's fighting the binding," Thomas realized, pressing his hand against the altar to steady himself. The scar on his palm burned fiercely as it came into contact with the stone. Daniel worked with remarkable focus, his engineering training evident in the precision of his carving. 5 symbols completed, then 6, then 7. As he began the 8th and final symbol, the one that would complete the circle and close the door, the whispering rose to a shriek. The chapel door burst open, but it wasn't the guards who entered. 3 hooded figures strode down the central aisle, led by a tall man whose hands glowed with an unnatural blue light. "Stop them!" the leader commanded, his voice familiar to Thomas even after a year. "Thorn," Thomas gasped, "you're in prison. The Fellowship has resources beyond your imagination, Professor," Thorn replied, throwing back his hood, "including loyal members within the federal prison system." The other 2 figures moved within human speed, reaching the altar before Thomas could react. One seized Daniel, pulling him away from his work. The final symbol remained unfinished, the binding incomplete. "The Carter heir," Thorn observed with satisfaction. "How convenient of you to deliver him directly to us." Thomas lunged for the chisel Daniel had dropped, determined to complete the binding, but the 3rd figure caught him with surprising strength. As the hood fell back, Thomas found himself staring into the face of Judge Thibodeau, not the elderly man who had helped him a year ago, but a younger version with the same features. His son, Thomas realized aloud. "The bloodline connections extend to all your families, don't they?" "Of course," Thorn smiled coldly. "The provider rewards loyalty across generations. The Thibodeau family has served since the beginning, alongside the Carters." Daniel struggled against his captor. "My family never served willingly. You murdered children." "Your ancestor understood necessity," Thorn countered. "Jonathan Carter knew that power requires sacrifice. His only mistake was completing the covenant too quickly. 7 sons in 7 years rather than spacing them throughout his lifetime. It weakened the provider temporarily." Thomas watched Thorn carefully, his mind racing. The Fellowship leader was standing directly in front of the altar, precisely where Thomas needed to be to complete the binding. "And what will you sacrifice now?" Thomas asked, playing for time. "Daniel is the last of the Carter line." Thorn's smile widened. "Not quite. We've located 3 other descendants through maternal lines, but Daniel's blood is strongest, most direct. He will anchor the new covenant, while the others will sustain it." "Children," Thomas said with disgust. "Always children. The provider prefers innocence," Thorn shrugged. "Now, Professor, you have something that belongs to us." He gestured to the binding formula paper on the floor. Thomas saw his opportunity. "You mean this?" He moved as if to retrieve the paper, but instead lunged for the altar, pressing his marked palm against the unfinished 8th symbol. The effect was immediate and shocking. Thomas's blood, connected to both the entity and the chapel through his previous encounter, began to flow from the reopened scar. As it touched the carved symbols, they glowed with the same blue-white light he had seen during the confrontation at the Carter Chapel. "No!" Thorn shouted, grabbing for Thomas, but it was too late. The blood completed the circuit, flowing through the 7 completed symbols and outlining the 8th where Daniel had begun it. The binding formula activated, sending a pulse of energy through the chapel that threw Thorn and his companions backward. The walls began to shake, plaster raining down from the ceiling. Thomas felt a presence swirling around him, not the entity itself, but the spirits of the 7 Carter boys, using his blood connection as a conduit just as they had before. "Daniel!" Thomas shouted above the growing tumult. "Finish the symbol!" Daniel broke free from his stunned captor and grabbed the chisel, working frantically to complete the final pattern, even as the chapel threatened to collapse around them. Thomas held his bleeding palm against the altar, channeling the energy of the binding. As Daniel carved the final line, completing the 8th symbol, a terrible shriek filled the chapel, a sound of ancient hunger denied. The entity's presence swirled visibly now, a dark mass trying desperately to escape the closing circle. Thorn staggered to his feet, his face contorted with rage and fear. "You can't! The provider has sustained us for generations." "Find another way to sustain yourselves," Thomas replied, pressing Marie's powder mixture into the freshly carved symbol. "One that doesn't require children's blood." The binding snapped into place with an audible crack, like a massive door slamming shut. The dark presence compressed into an impossibly small point above the altar, then vanished with a final defeated wail. The chapel fell suddenly silent, the vibrations ceasing. Thorne and his companions lay unconscious on the floor, the backlash of the binding having overwhelmed them. "Is it done?" Daniel asked, his voice hoarse. Thomas examined the altar. The 8 symbols now formed a complete circle, glowing faintly with traces of his blood. The mathematical pattern was perfect, a closed system from which nothing could escape. "It's done," he confirmed. "The doorway is sealed." Outside, they could hear shouts as the guards finally responded to the commotion. Elijah appeared at the vestry window, beckoning urgently. "We need to go," Thomas said, gathering the remaining materials. "The fellowship will be dealt with by the proper authorities this time." As they escaped into the night, Thomas looked back at the chapel one last time. For a moment, he thought he saw 7 small figures standing in the moonlight, their faces peaceful now, hands linked in a circle of their own. Then they were gone, and Thomas knew that the Carter boys had finally found their rest. Epilogue. In the years that followed, Thomas documented the entire case in a manuscript titled The Carter Covenant, though he published it only privately, sharing copies with those who had helped him and with trusted colleagues who might need the knowledge in the future. The fellowship members arrested at the chapel site revealed the organization's full extent under interrogation. Judges, politicians, bankers, and industrialists across the country, all grown wealthy from the entity's gifts over generations. The scandal rocked Louisiana society, though many details were suppressed to protect the public from the more supernatural elements of the case. Daniel Carter changed his name one final time and moved to California, where he founded an engineering firm specializing in earthquake-resistant architecture, buildings designed to contain and redirect energy, much like the binding formula had contained the entity. He never married, but adopted 2 sons, raising them with knowledge of their heritage and the importance of using privilege to protect rather than exploit. Thomas returned to his academic career, though his interests shifted from architectural history to the study of mathematical patterns in religious symbolism across cultures. The mark on his palm never fully healed, remaining as a faint scar that occasionally itched when he encountered certain ancient symbols in his research. Sometimes, late at night in his study, Thomas would feel a familiar chill, not the oppressive cold of the entity's presence, but something lighter, almost comforting. On these nights he would look up from his work to find his office empty, yet somehow not quite vacant. "Rest well, boys," he would whisper to the silent room. "The covenant is broken, the circle is closed. And somewhere in the space between mathematics and spirit, 7 souls remained forever free."